Good morning and welcome to the Buffalo Niagara Partnership's Next Steps, OSHA's Vaccine or Test Rule for Employers Webisode. My name is Seth Picarillo, Director of Economic Development here at the Partnership. Thank you for spending a part of your morning with the BNP. Over the past 20 months, the BNP has worked to update our members and the entire community on the most current COVID-related information and best practices. And that commitment continues today with this webisode. In September, the federal government announced a new mandate requiring all employers with 100 or more employees to ensure their workforce is either fully vaccinated or to require weekly testing of unvaccinated workers. In early November, the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, released an Emergency Temporary Standard, or ETS, that acts as the formal rule for this new mandate. The goal of today's webisode is to help employers understand who this ETS applies to, what it requires, how to best proceed, and how to form a policy moving forward to communicate this mandate and implement the policy around it. As we've seen over the past 20 months, there are county, state, and federal COVID-19 regulations that impact employers. Today's specific focus is the OSHA ETS on vaccination and testing. The BNP will continue to update our community and our members on all levels of COVID-19 regulations, and we encourage everyone to visit thepartnership.org for updates on all of those different levels of policy and requirements. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by Cindy Lawrence, Human Resources Consultant and Compliance Officer for Employer Services Corporation, to lead today's conversation. ESC is a locally based full-service HR outsourcing firm integrating HR, payroll, benefits, procurement, administration, and importantly for today's topic, compliance services. Cindy brings extensive HR and compliance experience to this conversation, including her own professional background in manufacturing and banking HR. Her high level of strategic expertise has proven to be a great asset for ESC, and her perspective on this new ETS will help our business community take the appropriate next steps. Before I hand the presentation over to Cindy, just a couple of quick updates. You'll see a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We are going to have a Q&A session with Cindy as time allows. So please type in your question in that field. If you see a question that's already been asked, please upvote it so it gets to the top of the list. Also, importantly, please type your name in the field as well. We cannot answer anonymous questions. If we don't get to your question today, our team will respond to you via email so that you can get the information that you need. We encourage everyone to visit our COVID-19 resources and impacts page on thepartnership.org. Over the past 20 months, our team has been compiling best practices, webisodes, updates to help you navigate this new normal. And we will also have some information about the ETS up as well. While on the website, we encourage everyone to take a look at our events page for upcoming events and content. For example, we look forward to the continued convening of our D&I Academy in February and March of 2022. And we also encourage all businesses to take a look at our Sales Leader Exchange and D&I Exchange as valuable professional development opportunities for your team. All this information can be found at thepartnership.org. With that, I'm very happy to invite in and turn things over to Cindy Lawrence from ESC to talk about the new OSHA ETS. Cindy, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having us, Seth, and thanks for letting us kind of dig into what can be very confusing for employers at this point. As you indicated already, Seth, the timeline for this has been interesting, to say the least. Next slide. It was in September when President Biden put out the actual directive. We knew this was coming. He indicated at his time of inauguration that he wanted to move in this direction. So it's been a few months that we've had an idea that this may be coming. So the DOL, through the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, did develop an emergency temporary standard that mandated all companies with 100 or more employees to mandate vaccinations for their entire staff or to allow a test out option. And that was actually filed with the Federal Register, published on November 5th. And it gave a 30-day window for the first part of this standard to be effective, and then a 60-day window for the actual vaccinations in place, vaccinations in the arms, if you will, or the testing option to begin to be documented. And within days of that publication, there were legal challenges. There were actually legal challenges to this filed before, ready to be filed, before it was actually published. So the first one was in the Fifth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, and they issued a temporary stay indicating that they wanted more time to really look and consider whether this mandate was actually enforceable, whether OSHA had the authority to put this type of directive in place. The Justice Department challenged that stay, and it was upheld eventually by the Fifth Circuit within I would say, probably a week or 10 days. Other lawsuits, there were a total of 27 states that combined other lawsuits into 6 different circuits. So there was a lot of activity. And given that much activity on the challenges front, the procedure, it requires that all get consolidated into one case. And that one case, where that's going to be held, is decided by a lottery. And it was, I think, last week, Tuesday, that it was announced that the Sixth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals was actually chosen to hear that kind of challenge by those states. And they have not yet announced a date for that hearing, but we expect it to be in the near future. As a result of all of those actions, all of that activity, knowing that there were challenges on so many fronts, OSHA acknowledged the stay. And they actually announced, and they have wording on their website, that they're suspending all activities related to the implementation and enforcement of that ETS, pending future developments in the litigation. And it's widely expected that this will not be settled until it goes to the US Supreme Court. And that's because I've read some of the underpinnings of these challenges, and they're very interesting. Not only do they deal with, does OSHA actually have the authority to put out these type of mandates, but also this has been an ongoing situation for well over a year and a half now. So what's the urgency at this point? And the U.S. Department of Justice is certainly going to appeal any kind of stays that do get put out there or determined. So I expect there will be a lot of back and forth, and we may not know whether this is truly enforceable, and OSHA is going to move along with the enforcement and their activities regarding the enforcement of this. But I think eventually the smart thing to do at this point is to be prepared. So what we're going to do today is give you the information you need to know who's affected, how are these employees counted, so you can determine if you are affected or not, and then what do you need to have in place. So that first set of requirements that was originally proposed to be in effect December 5th, let's move forward and at least get the underpinnings and the foundations in place so you are prepared if this does move forward. Next slide, please. So how do you determine who is a covered entity or a covered employer? Well, first of all, you have to count all employees, even if they're full-time or part-time, across all US locations, regardless of where the employee actually performs their work. So even if you have employees working from home, or you have employees that work outside, and there's wording that addresses those, just for the purpose of, am I covered? Am I considered an employer who has 100 plus employees? All of those employees must be counted. And the timing of this is, we've gotten questions about this. What about my seasonal employees? So on the day that this becomes enforceable, and there is some feeling that once this is upheld, if it is upheld, then there may be a 30-day period from that point on to actually have all your policies in place. So we'll be watching those dates carefully as well. But on the date that it becomes enforceable or in effect, you have to look at your employee count at that time. And if it's 100 at that time, you are a covered employer. If it's not 100 at that time, but you hit the 100 mark subsequently, at that time, you will be required to begin enforcing and complying with the mandate. Now, if you're at 100 at some point in time, then subject to this mandate, and your count falls below 100 in the future, you still have to comply with the mandate as long as it is in effect, as long as this ETS is in effect. And ETSs generally are in effect for a period of time, and then they become permanent. So we'll be watching that kind of progression as well. Who's not covered by this mandate? And this means who has to be vaccinated or be tested, who don't work with other employees. So those employees who work from their home, or those employees who work exclusively outdoors, while they do count for the purpose of determining whether you're covered under the ETS, they do not have to comply with the vaccination or the masking or the testing requirement. And that's an important point, especially if you have employees that work remotely, but occasionally come to the office. And we'll be talking about that scenario as we get into what is the test out option and who has to comply with that. What's not covered, entities that are not covered are workplaces where employees provide healthcare services. And this is an interesting point because just yesterday, this changed a little bit. Those medical facilities that are in contract with the CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, were covered by their own interim final rule, which very specifically stated the type of PPE and the type of mandates that were required for them because they were actually in a medical setting. And there was a stay on that ruling in 10 states. I think that was last week that stay got put in place. And then just the day before yesterday, and announced on December 1st, that stay has been extended nationwide. So we're kind of in a state of flux with all of these mandates and interim rules. There was an OSHA ETS specifically for medical facilities in June, put out in June, and that is still in effect. So we've got these CMS requirements that are in question. We've also got the mandates for federal contractors that are in question right now. The federal government has announced that they will not be enforcing those requirements for federal contractors until after the first of the year. So this is, something we're going to be watching very, very carefully as time goes on. Next, please, Seth. So let's talk about what the ETS does require. And this is the first round. This is what I referred to as your kind of foundation. What should you do to prepare for this? And it's wise to be prepared for this because we do not know what's going to happen. And the December 5th was the deadline or date given, was the first kind of round of requirements that came 30 days after this was published. As I said, this may be pushed out a little bit once its enforceability is actually determined. We will see. But initially, the first round of requirements is that all employers develop, implement, and enforce a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy, or it's the employer's choice to permit employees to conduct and provide proof of weekly testing. So that's the basic policy you need to develop. And you need to provide all employees with information on your policy, What are your procedures? How are you responding to that ETS? You also have to give them COVID-19 testing and face covering requirements for those who are going to remain unvaccinated. There's a CDC document published, key things to know about COVID-19 vaccines that you need to provide to employees. You also have to provide them information reiterating that any retaliation or discrimination is not allowed. There are protections against those in the regulations, things like discrimination of someone who may have a religious accommodation request. We'll get into accommodations in a moment. Information about laws that provide for criminal penalties for knowingly supplying false statements. So policy needs to be fairly robust. Again, just like when we went through with the HEROES Act, having to disseminate this policy to employees, this is going to be required. The ETS also requires that employers provide up to 4 hours of paid leave for employees to receive each vaccination dose. So up to 4 hours for each dose means a total of up to 8 hours. The ETS did not define booster shots or discuss booster shots at all in terms of their definition of fully vaccinated. At this point in time for the ETS, fully vaccinated means the initial 2 shots, that's for the Pfizer or the Moderna, or 1 shot for the J&J. You also need to provide, if an employee has adverse reaction to a vaccination, a reasonable amount of paid sick leave, reasonable amount. In the FAQs that were published, this generally seems to be acceptable, reasonable amount if you provide up to 2 days. Of course, if there's a situation where someone has a very severe reaction, you would be expected to extend that a little bit. Employees recovering from vaccine side effects may be required to use their own sick time if they have it accrued. But if they don't have anything left, you must extend additional time to them. And there's also interesting information in the ETS about the use of sick time. If you have only 1 bank of paid time off and it's not labeled sick time, then the employee is not required to use that for an adverse effect. You will have to extend paid time off to them. However, if you have sick leave and vacation, then the sick leave they may be required to use. So that can be a little confusing. We expect that if you're an ESC client, we'll be walking through those scenarios with you if and when we need to have these conversations, determine whether you have 1 bank of PTO or whether you actually have a sick leave called out in determining what bank of time an employee will be charged, or whether you need to extend that if they have a need for this paid sick leave for an adverse reaction. I think the most important thing for employers to do to prepare for this, obviously while you're developing your policy and having that ready to go, is to maintain a confidential and current employee roster with vaccination status. So you can put out a memo to your employees stating that you are preparing for this and you are gathering that information at this time. And you are doing so, treating it as confidential medical information. It will only be accessible by those who have a need to have this, most likely your HR, or if you're a very small person, if you're a very small administrative staff, perhaps just 1 person who handles those types of things. And then set up a tracking mechanism for determining who is providing you with that proof of vaccination status. So once the vaccine or testing part becomes applicable, you know who you need to gather weekly test results from, and you know who you have vaccination proof from. So you're going to want to set up that tracking mechanism. I know there are companies out there who are prepared to supply tracking mechanisms. I think you can probably use an Excel spreadsheet at the very basic level and have someone maintain that. Again, this spreadsheet, along with your roster, is going to be considered private HIPAA protected information. So you're going to want to make sure that it's carefully accessed by only those who have a need to have this information. Next, please, Seth. And here's what has to happen by this 60-day after effective date of the ETS. And originally that would have been January 4th. So we'll see when this actually becomes a requirement. But once this date gets determined and we hit it, you have to ensure that your employees either have the necessary shots to be considered fully vaccinated, and that is the first 2 doses, no boosters at this time, or they've produced negative COVID-19 tests on at least a weekly basis. So you can gather acceptable forms of proof of vaccination from employees, which include a record of immunization from a healthcare provider or the pharmacy that's given them the vaccination. You can use a copy of their COVID-19 vaccination record card. You can use a copy of any medical record that documented the vaccination. You can use a copy of immunization records from a public health, state, or tribal immunization information system. So something like those Excelsior passes, that would be acceptable. Or a copy of any other official documentation that verified the following information: what vaccine type, what was the date it was administered, and what was the name of the healthcare professional or the clinic site where it was administered. So those are all acceptable forms of proof of vaccination. Next, please, Seth. And here's another final acceptable form of proof of vaccination that can be a little tricky, right? We can ask employees if they cannot produce any of those other acceptable forms, we can ask the employee to produce an attestation. If they cannot produce any other acceptable proof of vaccination, but they have to sign and date a statement that includes the following information. They have to attest to their vaccination status, which includes the date of the vaccination as well as the type of vaccination. They have to state that they have lost or are otherwise unable to provide that proof to you. And they have to acknowledge that they know that providing false information regarding their status may subject them to criminal penalties. An important point was made in the ETS that OSHA certainly does not expect employers to be kind of the vaccination police when it comes to determining if fraud is happening or not happening. So there was a question posed, is the employer going to be responsible if an employee provides an attestation that proves to be false? And the answer is no. OSHA does not, they certainly don't expect you to condone or encourage any kind of false statements, but they don't expect you to vet them either. So, that may give you a little bit more comfort in accepting these attestations, but I think it's really, really important. And this is why it should be strongly stated in your policy that any type of false documentation, false statements that an employee provides to you regarding their vaccination status could be grounds for criminal action and penalties to them, not to the employer. And if you've already collected attestations prior to the effective date of the ETS, you do not need to re-verify or recollect those attestations. So if you have something on file already, you don't need to get another documentation of vaccination status from someone. So a lot of kind of things to be aware of as far as proof of vaccination. Next, please, Seth. So when you're putting together your policy, here's what you're going to want to include. Are you going to require vaccinations, or will you allow weekly testing opt-out? And if someone is weekly testing as an opt-out of getting vaccinated, they will be required to wear face masks in lieu of the vaccination at all times. Now, this may be a little bit of a moot point in New York State, because right now, having the HERO Act in effect, and it's in effect right now until December 13th. And honestly, I don't see that being dropped at that date, given the time of year and given what's happening with the numbers of positive cases. I don't see the HEROES Act being dropped, but we will see. The HERO Act requires in the workplaces the wearing of masks, regardless of vaccination status. So, you know, and another interesting point that brings up is the fact that the OSHA ETS is meant to be kind of a baseline of enforcement. So even if that HEROES Act gets dropped, the OSHA ETS will still require the wearing of face masks in lieu of vaccination for those who are unvaccinated. So there's going to be a little bit of coordination. The ETS was meant, again, as I said, as a baseline. And certainly if there are state or local requirements for more protections than the ETS puts in place, certainly the ETS is not written to override those. It's written as a baseline. You're going to want to include, your policy also includes an exception and accommodation request process. For anybody who's not able to receive a vaccination, either for medical reasons or due to their deeply held religious belief, you're going to want to put that process in place so they know who to contact, who to have the conversation with. And your people at your workplace who are going to be responsible for this request, this accommodation request process, should be very well versed in how do I go about doing that? What's the best practice? And certainly our ESC clients know that they have their business partner to reach out to in that situation if they have questions on those, if they start getting those accommodation requests for either medical or religious reasons. Because while the ETS may be in effect, we still need to comply with ADA requirements and the EEOC requirements for discrimination. Your policy should also include the date by which all current employees have to be fully vaccinated and provide that proof, or begin their weekly testing. So you need to spell that out for current employees. This or this must happen by date. And you should also include what's the time frame for your new hires. Are you going to give them a short period of time once they're hired to obtain those vaccinations, or are you going to require they be vaccinated at the time they start? You need to set that time frame for current and new hires in your policy. You're also going to want to include all those acceptable forms of proof of vaccination. You're going to want to spell out exactly how you're going to protect that information. You're going to want to put your procedures for how does someone request paid time off to obtain a vaccination. Are you going to develop a specific form? Who are they going to make that request to? Who is going to have the conversation with them about, is it possible for you to get this vaccination after hours? If they're being away from the workplace is going to affect your production or your availability of having employees ready, willing, and able to work, can handle the business and customer needs that you have. So you're going to want to specify in your policy, how do they go about requesting the time off for getting those vaccinations. You also are going to want to spell out that there is sick time available if side effects of the vaccination prohibit them from working. So if you do have a sick time bank actually spelled out, you're going to want to let them know that time is available to them to use. If they don't have any accrued time left in that paid sick bank, then you are going to have to extend a reasonable amount of time for them. And if an employee can continue to work, even if they're feeling a little under the weather, i.e. they work remotely, or they have out of the office tasks that they can do at home for a short period of time, that certainly is an option. So keep that in mind as well. Next slide, please. All right, what happens if an employee tests positive for COVID-19? You're going to have a procedure in place. If an employee who is using the testing out option from the mandated vaccination and one of those tests turns up positive, or they're diagnosed with COVID-19 by a licensed healthcare provider, what are your leave policies for those circumstances? How are you going to treat that person? What sick time is available to them? How are you going to ensure that they report that information to you in a timely manner so they're not returning to the workplace and perhaps exposing other coworkers? So that's going to need to be spelled out in your policy. And I know this sounds like a lot of detail, and it truly is. I want to let you know, OSHA does have some model policies on their website that can be used as a starting point for you. So you can look at those, and they actually have wording in those model policies that are in italics, so you know what you should be customizing for your workplace. So do take advantage of those. I know some of this may start to sound a little overwhelming, but there are model policies out there for you. You're going to want to spell out what are your testing requirements for those who decline the vaccination. So be very specific. Those who decline getting vaccinated or they're covered by an accommodation, even those covered by an accommodation, if you end up granting those requests, those people must be tested at a minimum of once of every 7 days. And yes, they do have to provide proof of that negative test to you. And you have to keep a record of that negative test result. What type of tests are acceptable? They have to be FDA approved. So most of those would be either the PCR tests, which I don't expect because of the length of time they take to be returned, will be used for these situations. Most of these types of tests will be the over-the-counter tests that are available, or the rapid tests that are available. Those are FDA approved. Those are most likely suited for this weekly testing requirement. But here's an interesting stipulation in the ETS. If an employee self-administers an over-the-counter test, they cannot self-read those results. So if you have employees that are going to go the weekly testing route, they're going to want to go to a site to be tested where they get a result that they can present to you. If you decide you are going to accept over-the-counter self-administered testing, then it's recommended that you have the employee bring the results to you to read. So some employers may be comfortable doing that. Some may not want to be bothered by doing that, or they feel it's too overly burdensome from an administrative standpoint. So you're going to have to determine if you are going to allow over-the-counter COVID testing for the people that are not going to be vaccinated or have a reasonable accommodation. How are you going to handle that? Because the results of a self-administered and a self-read test are not acceptable according to the ETS. Keep in mind that test results that you're going to be required to gather and keep on file are medical records. Again, these are things that must be handled confidentially. A lot of questions about who pays for the testing, and clear in the ETS that the employee is required to pay for the testing. The employer is not required to pay for the testing. And the employer is also not required to pay for the time away from work to be tested. Obviously, the testing can happen outside of work hours. If an employee decides that they want to go the testing route because they do not want a vaccination or cannot get a vaccination, they're going to have to make arrangements to get these tests outside of work hours. And an important stipulation in the ETS also was that if someone is going to be testing weekly, face coverings are required by them in the workplace. And again, as I mentioned, the HEROES Act that's in effect right now is pretty much put all employees, vaccinated or not, in a face covering requirement right now. So this may not be as important while the HEROES Act is in effect, but it will be in the future, perhaps. Next, please. So you're going to want to spell out who's going to be responsible for ensuring that the people that are testing are wearing masks. How are you going to ensure that they are, if they're employees who are working outdoors exclusively and not covered by the ETS, even though they're covered by the HEROES Act now, how are you going to ensure that they know that they're, whenever they're in close proximity with someone, for instance, if they're riding in a vehicle with another person for work purposes, you need to ensure that they know if they're not fully vaccinated, face coverings are required at all times in those situations. Spell out the disciplinary process if the policy is not followed. Very important. What are you going to do? Are you going to use this as terms for immediate dismissal? Are you going to use a progressive disciplinary policy? State what disciplinary policy you will have in effect, and make sure that your supervisors are trained in that and are comfortable with that, or they know to contact HR if they have questions about that and enlist HR's help. You're also going to want to ensure that your policy includes that statement of confidentiality, assuring employees that you will maintain the privacy of all information collected in compliance with the ETS, any vaccination status, any testing results, all of those will be handled confidentially. Who's going to have access to that information? Who's responsible for maintaining its privacy? And a statement ensuring that you will not allow any retaliation against anyone for either choosing the mandate, choosing to be vaccinated under the mandate, or choosing not to be and complying with the weekly testing requirement, or discriminating against anyone who perhaps presents you with a medical or a religious accommodation request. So important that the policy includes all of those statements, all of those assurances, all of those directions to the employees, so they're very clear on what is expected. And certainly this is something that you can begin to develop now, even if we don't know where the ETS is going to fall out. Certainly it's wise to be prepared. We expect that, even if it's a while before we know one way or the other, I don't think the Department of Justice is going to give up. I'm sorry, the Department of Labor is going to give up easily on this ETS, and we need to stay tuned and, again, be prepared. At that point, Seth, I think we'll open it up to any questions, if there's any additional questions that people have submitted.
Cindy, thank you so much for that. And we have some questions coming in. What I took away from it was, like you said, this is there's some pending legal action, but the key message is to be prepared.
Yes.
And one of the things you said for being prepared was start by getting that vaccination roster ready so that you can become up and running, if and when this comes into effect.
Yes.
We had a good question that we answered during it from David. So the actual testing, that is an employee cost as far
Correct.
as the test and time, and
Correct.
it can't be self-read. But vaccination is paid time off. They're able to go and get vaccinated in keeping with the current New York state law. Right? I just wanted to make sure that we had those two different things. So there's a difference between employee responsibility and vaccination and testing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's clear from the requirement that employers pay for the time to get vaccinated. That was in effect under New York state regulations, but now the federal government also is picking up on that. You can see by that, I believe, that there is a strong desire to encourage people to get the vaccinations. And this is one way to do that, by providing them with paid time off to actually go and get those vaccinations.
So that's an important point. Even though we know there's some legal pending action, let's talk about penalty. This is a requirement, and requirements have penalties associated with them. From what we know now, what is the ETS saying about the employer penalty for not complying with the ETS?
Yeah, the penalty for one instance, one situation, is close to $14,000. It's $13,000 and some dollars. So you're looking at a significant impact for one situation. If you've got multiple infractions or complaints, or it's determined to be willful, that can jump by the number of instances, or if it's determined to be willful, that's times 10. So you're talking a significant amount of money for an employer that does not put a policy in place, start collecting information, start requiring weekly testing for those who have not provided any vaccination proof. Those are the things that an employer has to do. Now, we've gotten some questions on what happens if you've got employees who are being a little recalcitrant, who are kind of pushing back and saying, I'm not doing this. Certainly they are putting the employer at risk. So I would say, think long and hard about what disciplinary action you want to put in place for these types of situations. We do know there are employees out there who say, no way, I'm not getting the vaccination. You can't make me. We'll see how the courts fall out on that. We'll also see if they then refuse to be tested, what are you prepared to do? And, I think you really do need to consider long and hard the penalties that may come to the employer if the employee is not complying. So you need to be prepared to take disciplinary action up to and including termination.
That was going to be my next question. This was a good question on the OSHA FAQ. So if there is an employer that's trying to act in good faith, but is having employees that are not complying, it's like with any other HR issue, it's document, saying this is what we tried to do. These are the steps that we have taken. And I think it's important too for people to start to think about, and we have some information on our website about policy, about communication around vaccination. All of this needs to be communicated to employees very well once this ETS goes into effect, because you don't want to be in a situation where someone can say, well, I didn't know what was being asked of me.
Yes, absolutely correct. Right. We need to be clear in our policies so we can prove that we've told the employees this is what's required. And we need to be clear in our policies as to what we're going to do if an employee refuses to comply, up to and including termination. And just like in any other disciplinary situation, if you're going to use progressive discipline, for instance, you're going to tell someone, okay, you did not give me a test result and you have not provided me with a vaccination record. You have until X date to provide one of those two things to me, and set some deadlines, document those deadlines, have follow-up conversations. If you want to say initially to someone, you've got 14 days to provide this and comply, and 14 days comes and goes and they do not, you may want to say, you've now got 2 days to do something, or we're going to have to terminate your employment or put you on an unpaid leave until you comply. Or, and be careful with that, because you want to make sure that you establish in that disciplinary process that you have had a conversation about whether this person is covered by a medical or a religious accommodation request. And if there is no such coming forward from that employee, you're going to want to document that as well, just to kind of prove, if you will, that you've given them every opportunity to comply or request an accommodation and they are refusing.
Right. And that's where, while this is a new issue, there are some similarities to other HR, practices about setting up a timeline and document.
Yes, absolutely.
Michelle has a question. I think you touched on it earlier, but asking about temporary staff. From what I'm hearing from you, this applies to everyone, whether it be temporary, seasonal employees that are at home or work outside 100% of the time. It is about all of your employees across all locations, correct?
That is correct. Keep in mind, independent contractors are not employees, so they are not covered by this, and they would not count towards your 100 employee threshold to determine whether you need to comply with this or not. And you said temporary employees. If you are directly employing someone on a temporary basis, say for a short-term project, they would be covered if they're your employee. If it's a temporary employee that came through an agency, the agency would be responsible for that person's compliance. And they would not, an agency employee, a temporary agency employee would not be counted in your 100-person threshold. Now, you may want to ask the agency that you work with to ensure that people are either vaccinated or testing weekly, but that is not your requirement and they are not counted towards your threshold. Interesting point.
Then, especially about the agency employees, that's a very important designation.
Right.
I had a question from Dennis here. So if there is a employee that has already had COVID, they're not able to use a natural immunity of saying, hey, I've already had COVID, I can't get it again. That is not something that they can come in as a attestation of saying, I don't need to be either tested or vaccinated, correct?
Correct. This is even called out in the, I believe it's in the ETS itself. The ETS is 490 pages, so I imagine it is, but it's clearly spelled out in the FAQs that natural immunity is not recognized as a substitute for either vaccination or weekly testing.
And as you said earlier, boosters are not referenced in the ETS, assuming that this was written before boosters became more of the process here for immunization.
That's correct. Yep, that is correct. And the FAQs even address that. Fully vaccinated is considered to be the initial 1 dose for the J&J or the 2 dose for the Pfizer and the Moderna.
That's an important note. So I think, as we close this, and we're very appreciative of Cindy Lawrence's expertise from ESC here, the message we're hearing is, yes, everyone should track where this is as far as legal challenge, but be prepared, especially this time of year where there's a lot going on, that, in the beginning of next year, be prepared for this to become a live ETS. Start by looking at your vaccination roster and having a plan put together for communicating this with employees.
Absolutely. You can't go wrong being prepared with a policy. If you don't need it, at least you're prepared. And OSHA has tried to make it not too cumbersome by giving you a model policy to reference. You just need to customize it.
And one more question just came in. So, and I think you touched on it, but vaccination status is confidential. That Excel, that sheet or whatever tracking method you're using, that's a HIPAA protected document.
Yes.
And so the confidentiality is key there as well.
Yes.
And one point as we close, as we've been talking about vaccination, there's a lot of conversation and discourse about vaccination and testing. We see that there is a higher level of trust when this conversation happens in the workplace as opposed to outside of the workplace. So employers understanding this is a regulation that is going to add new layers of work in the workplace, but you have an opportunity to have a conversation about this ETS that will be trusted a little bit differently if it happens somewhere else. So it's a unique opportunity to talk to your employees. So Cindy, thank you very much again from ESC from being here with us. Thank you all for being a part of this. We had a question earlier. We will share this slide deck with everyone, as well as a link to the OSHA FAQ, because those are comprehensive and helpful. And we hope that everybody has a good rest of the day. Thank you for starting your day with the BNP. Take care.
Thank you.